So, Julie, today we're going to be talking about spiritual leadership. And I think my first question is, what does spiritual leadership mean anyways?
Man, when I think about spiritual leadership, I do think that most people lean towards, oh, that's the man's job in the home.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with that, to protect and to serve well, to lead out. But in 34 years of marriage, I can honestly say that there's been a real ebb and flow in that there have been times where we've experienced Jay just being completely exhausted, overwhelmed with work. And I'm the one who goes over to him and says, hey, can I pray for you? How can I support you? And I think maybe we need to think about this because you're not thriving. We're not thriving. And so it feels like in having conversations with couples that there is a tremendous amount of pressure on men and even women. They'll tell me, oh yeah, I found this book on spiritual leadership and I highlighted these things and I put it in the bathroom where I knew he'd see it, where he sits for forever. And I'm just hoping that he's going to get a clue. And I think that's hard on men and it's hard on the couple. So maybe a better perspective would be to think about a triangle, and you and your spouse are on each side here, and you're pointing towards Jesus. So you're focused on Jesus, and the goal would be for both of you to be growing and to pay attention to what God is calling you to in this moment, in this season, in your marriage.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful illustration because when you think of that kind of triangle graphic that you mentioned, the closer you grow to the Lord, the closer you become with your spouse.
Yes.
And the more that you lean into your relationship with God, you truly learn to love and lead better in a relationship. And
Yes.
I think your point about men feeling that pressure is such a great point because I think so many men, you step into marriage and there's this expectation
Step up,
that you
lead.
feel when you first get in and you're like, okay, but I don't actually know what this looks like.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people, especially if it's not modeled for you and your parents,
Yeah.
it can feel like such a high level to try to achieve. I think a lot of people just get to a point where they're like, I don't even know what this looks like, so I'm not going to try to pursue it anyways. And then, like you said, I think there is so much of that dynamic of wives a lot of times wanting to encourage their husbands to be good spiritual leaders. And like you said, leaving the books on the bathroom counter or whatnot. And that just creates this weird
It's
tension.
intimidating.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
It's an interesting relationship dynamic. But I think when it comes to spiritual leadership, real practically, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
For one, I would ask, how are you growing in your relationship in the Lord? So what are you taking in that would help you lead well?
Yeah.
And there's lots of different books out there that are absolutely outstanding in that area. And the other thing that I would say is I strongly encourage men and women to be discipled by people who are further along in the journey. So when you ask, well, what does spiritual leadership look like? Because I've had some men say to me, my way or the highway in my home, because I'm the spiritual leader.
Yeah.
And you watch their spouse cringe. Because when you think about, well, what does Jesus say about that? He's like, hey, care for your bride like Christ cares for the church. And at the same time, for wives, what does it look like to lead well and care for your husband, to respect him and to honor the relationship? So learning by being in relationship with others who are ahead of you on the journey, paying attention to what does the word say about let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but what is good for building others up. So how are we building each other up? It is really the dynamic and concepts of good leadership based in the word.
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like you can't give what you don't have.
100%.
And so if you don't have that foundation of being poured into, and even that just base level relationship where you're in the word every day and you're having your quiet time and you're pursuing that on your own, then bringing that into a relationship context isn't going to work very well.
Well, I think this whole relational aspect of it, power and control, will never work well.
Yeah.
But building a healthy relationship and being loving and caring and cherishing each other and respecting each other and helping each other to grow. Most people experience God differently. So if you've never really thought about, well, how does my spouse experience the Lord, and what is worshipful for them? Sacred Pathways is a wonderful inventory that people can take by themselves, but then share with their spouse so that I understand, hey, how can I help you grow? How can I walk alongside you? How can we grow together by being curious and better understanding where I am in my walk with the Lord and what I need right now?
Yeah. And we talk about, there's all sorts of personality tests. There's the Enneagram, there's Myers-Briggs and whatnot. But how impactful is that to better understand where your spouse relates to God? And I think that's such an interesting question that probably most of us haven't thought about before. And so taking time to understand, like, oh, they actually relate to God in this way, and that's different from me.
Yeah.
And that's okay too.
Yeah.
I think is a super powerful thing to hear.
You make me think about some experiences that we've actually had at retreats at WinShape Marriage. And one of the things that we have walked spouses through is the opportunity to pray a blessing over their spouse. And it has, it's been overwhelming at times to watch, especially the wives, pray a blessing over their husband, and how emotional it is for men. I think men feel an incredible amount of pressure that they're not confident they can live up to.
Yeah. And
so they always feel like they're just one step behind. And to have a wife say, I believe in you and I just want to bless you. I can tear up thinking about it because it is very emotional to experience. And so I just think we need to be gracious with each other and understand that, I grew up in a very different situation when it comes to church. I was in church my whole entire life and very active. And my husband, not so much, but he was discipled by a group of men before we got married. So we were in two really different places, but being able to come together and grow together as a couple and also individually, impactful when it comes to spiritual leadership in our home.
Yeah, and you're talking about the praying a blessing over your husband and that encouragement. And I think through just how impactful that is for men in particular to hear just that little bit of encouragement. And I think through like trying to encourage your husband to become more of a spiritual leader or to grow in that area, like even those little moments of encouragement mean so much to men. And I think that's worth calling out for sure.
It means so much to everybody. Yeah. When are you motivated and excited about growing? Not when someone's beating you over the head saying, be more, do more.
Yeah.
That's when you start wanting to back out of the room, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So it's when you feel like they're for me. They want me to grow and they're excited and we're doing it together.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to get excited to do things out of obligation, but when you can do something out of encouragement, it feels so much more rewarding to actually want to pursue that. So I think that's a great point. I think there are probably people listening to this conversation that might be in a position where maybe their spouse is in a different place spiritually, and they're listening to all this and they're saying, okay, that's great, but we're on completely different pages. What would you say to someone in that scenario about how they can invite God into their relationship?
Well, I think that one, you can have a conversation around it, not from a, hey, you're not growing, but more from a perspective of, it would be exciting to me to know, hey, where do you feel like you are in your relationship with the Lord right now? What is the condition of your heart? And how can I come alongside you as your spouse and be encouraging to you in your efforts to grow with the Lord and to also grow together spiritually? Yeah. Just having conversation about how we worship together. Do we go to church together? How do we experience worship? When do you feel closest to the Lord? What are things that we could do as a couple that would give us opportunity to have conversation about where we are, what we're feeling, how we've experienced God, where we've seen him work in our relationship. Jay and I were talking just the other day, just about in 34 years, how we've seen God show up and be faithful. And it's when you do that, you recognize that even in times where he's seemed very quiet, that he's used your spouse to encourage you, or he's used your spouse to, stand strong next to you, like, I'm for you, and we're going to do this together. And when you look back and you remember, even that is like, wow, isn't that cool how God gave us exactly what we needed? Maybe not in the time we were like, okay, Lord, man, this is feeling really tense here.
Yeah.
But he showed up in big ways. Maybe he brought somebody to us that gave us a word, or we were reading something and it's like, but God.
Yeah.
But God, there is no other explanation. We wouldn't have gotten through that, whether it's health or a career change unexpectedly, or just super challenging times with a child.
Yeah.
You can see the Lord showing up, and you recognize, we are growing, and we're doing things together, and God is leading us, and we're expectant. Our eyes are wide open for, Lord, where do you want us to join you in your work? What are you calling us to as a couple and individually?
Yeah. And that's one of the beautiful things about being on a team in marriage is, and I think we talked about this in one of our earlier podcasts, but you're not always going to be 100.
No, you're not.
There's going to be moments where one of you might be struggling. One of you might be questioning your faith.
Yes.
And in those moments, it's the job of the other spouse to be the encourager and to help uplift the other person in that scenario. And I think that's just so beautiful.
Or just to cry with you.
Yes.
Like, I don't know what we're going to do tomorrow. I don't know how we're going to walk through this, but man, I'm going to cry with you, and I'm going to be in it. I am all in it with you.
Yeah. And there's that quote from Ted Lowe who says, I don't need you to fix this. I need you to feel this.
Right.
Just sitting in those moments with your spouse
Yes.
is super powerful. And so it sounds like in those moments where you and your spouse might be on a separate page, just taking a pulse for where they're at and having a conversation, maybe daily, just, hey, where are we at today?
Yeah.
Kind of where do we go from here?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a good word.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think when it comes to the topic of spiritual leadership and spiritual intimacy in marriage, I think there's so much to be excited about. And I think you can really see an impact on your relationship when you invest in your spiritual relationship with one another and the Lord. And I think there's so much encouraging research that we've been seeing just about what that looks like in a marriage context.
Well, we were having a conversation earlier today just about a recent study that came out of Baylor, where they looked at 10,000 couples and their prayer life. And they found that couples who pray together, which honestly, not a lot of couples do that. So this is an encouragement to do that.
Yes, for sure.
If you're not doing it, you can start slow. But the idea of praying together it's a window to your soul. And couples who do that, they experience better communication, more satisfaction in their marriage. They felt respected by each other. The conflict that they did experience, they felt like they managed it actually better. And conversations or feelings like towards divorce just plummeted to zero.
Yeah.
And I think we need to pay attention to that because there is something powerful about prayer. And the Lord tells us that in the Word.
Yeah.
But thinking that we don't have time for it or that it's scary. I can remember a mentor couple, they were in their 80s when they started mentoring us. And they said, hey, one thing that we've really found that's important in our relationship spiritually to grow together is praying together. Yeah. And she said, we actually started out with pinky prayers because we were just uncomfortable. So we agreed that we were going to hold pinkies and we were going to pray silently for 60 seconds for each other. Then we were going to say amen. So that's how we started. And then we moved to, we actually were going to tell each other, hey, this is what's on my heart. These are the things that I'm thinking about. Would you pray for those things? And she said, we were doing pinky prayer and we were praying silently, but we were being intentional to pray about what the other asked to be prayed for.
Yeah.
And then we got to this place where we were on our knees and we each prayed for each other out loud. And we just decided we weren't going to be flowery about it. We were just going to just say what came to our minds, because what God cares about is that we come to him and that we bring our requests to him and we seek his face for what he has for us. And she said, man, it just took our marriage to a totally different place in feeling understood and feeling close, spiritually intimate. It was powerful.
Yeah. And I think the beautiful thing about that example is, I think when you think about spiritual leadership and spiritual intimacy, it's easy to look at other couples that you might see in church and say, why aren't we where they are?
Oh,
and I
it's a
think
dangerous place to go.
The amazing thing about that example is it's like, just start where we're at.
Yeah.
And then each day, try to take a step further than that. You know, like, let's grow and focus on us and not what other people are.
Oh my goodness, let me tell you. I've had so many conversations with all those other couples, and I can just say the most powerful thing you can do is you do you.
Yeah.
Because you have no earthly idea what everybody else is dealing with, and more than likely, it may not be the same struggles that you're having, but I promise you, life is life, and everybody, it is not pain-free, it is not challenge-free. Everybody gets a part of the adventure, and so don't compare. Just do you.
For sure. Just take it one day at a time.
Yes.
Focus on what you guys are doing.
Yes.
Continue to grow together and grow with the Lord, and then you'll look back probably 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, and you'll think, man, it's amazing how we got to this place.
Yeah, one thing that I think about as you're just sharing is that it could be really powerful for couples to think about, what do we as a couple feel like God is calling us to in our marriage? I can remember pretty early on, maybe 5-7 years in, Jay and I were talking about, like, what brings meaning and what do we think is valuable? What's our north?
Yeah.
And we decided that being in ministry together, being connected to our family and to people who we felt like were for our marriage, and then just having a sense of adventure, like not being afraid to try new things. And not very long ago, we were working on preparing for a retreat, and we were asking ourselves, hey, where are we with those 3 things? And we were like, you know what? It's really been our compass for our whole entire married life. And we would still tell you that those 3 things are still really important to us. Yeah. So even deciding on that, because it helps you to know, where are you going to spend your time and energy? What are you going to spend your time thinking about? Are those things, those are the things that matter. They're the priority for us.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, is having that alignment in that direction.
Yeah.
And then in, like, being prayerful in that and asking God, where do you want us to grow into?
Yes.
And then using that as the North Star for your relationship, I think is a great thing to do for sure. So Julie, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been wonderful. And I think we can take away a lot from your answers.
You're welcome.
Thank you guys so much for listening to the WinShape Marriage Podcast. Be sure to join us back here next week for the next episode.
Have a marriage question you'd like answered on the show? We'd love to hear from you. Visit winshapemarriage.org/podcast to submit your question today.